In this series, enlightening series of talks on Nehru's work and world, we have had five very important talks by very distinguished speakers: Gauhar Raza, Sham Saran, Ashok Vajpayee, Purushottam Agarwal, S. Irfan Habib, and in the sixth talk today, we have another distinguished scholar, Professor Aditya Mukherjee. Professor Aditya Mukherjee, among a lot of us, doesn't need an introduction, but just for everybody's sake, Professor of Contemporary History and former Director of Institute of Advanced Studies at JNU, also visiting professor at universities like Duke of Rome, Sao Paulo, Tokyo, author or co-author of many celebrated works, including on the struggle for independence. He is currently editor of Modern Indian History, a Sage publication. Welcome, Professor Aditya Mukherjee. It's such a great pleasure to have you amidst us. And we are looking forward to your talk, basically on the compulsions and the context of Nehru's economic policy. I like to just small incident. It was soon after Mr. Manmohan Singh had done his famous 91 budget, and I was in a SAARC meeting, and J.S. Bhagwati, Professor J.S. Bhagwati, was the chief guest. Manmohan Singh was the chief guest, but the speaker was Professor Bhagwati. Now, Bhagwati said that whether it is Manmohan Singh or me, we were all the economists were absolutely in favor of Nehruvian economics. And now we are talking about reforms as if we were not in favor of that economics. So that's been the usual trend, poor Nehru, I might say. But anyway, please enlighten us, Professor Aditya Mukherjee.
Thank you very much, Ashok ji. I think it has been a very timely intervention by you in these days of demonizing Nehru, an attempt to vilify him, to virtually write him out of history, to declare him responsible for all possible evils. In fact, if you have seen a cartoon that is doing the rounds today, it says that Modi ji has repealed the farm laws, relieving the burden on the peasantry imposed by Jawaharlal Nehru. So even so the topic of my talk today is the compulsions and context of Nehru's economic policy, and not what Ashok ji wrote in his last message, that is Nehru and economic theory, though while talking of this, there will be, as you will see, an overlap between the two. In today's talk, I'll attempt to assess Nehru's contribution to the making of the post-colonial Indian economy. His contribution in this area was no less significant than his huge role in establishing and nurturing a secular and democratic polity in India, rescuing it from the mad Holocaust-like situation created by the partition of the country and the murder of the father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, by Hindu communal forces who were hell-bent on using this opportunity to build a Hindu state, the counterpart of a Muslim Pakistan. In the economic sphere, Nehru had the stupendous task of unstructuring the colonial structuring of the Indian economy, which had occurred over nearly 200 years, of putting India on the developmental path starting from the abysmal initial conditions. This is very important, that we must remember the initial conditions that were left behind by the colonial state from where he had to start. The initial conditions which the poet Rabindranath Tagore so evocatively expressed shortly before his death in 1941. He said, the wheels of fate will someday compel the English to give up their Indian empire. What kind of India will they leave behind? What stark misery? When the stream of their centuries' administration runs dry at last, what a waste of mud and filth will they leave behind? So it is from this mud and filth that Nehru has to make a start, which we must remember as the first point. At independence, to give you some examples, India had 84% illiteracy. 92% of the women were illiterate. It was a famine-ridden country where a famine occurred in one part of the country or the other almost every year. We had an average life expectancy of just about 30 years. Average, which means the poor must have died when they were much younger, maybe in the 5 or 6 or 10. Per capita income in India had been shrinking annually at 0.2% per annum for the previous 3 decades before independence. Agricultural output was shrinking at 0.72% per annum. Food grain output was shrinking even faster at 1.14% per annum. As we shall see below, Nehru had to launch a brilliant multi-pronged strategy to lift India out of this morass, which set an example to numerous other countries emerging out of colonialism after World War II. In recent years, however, there has been a growing tendency, particularly among neo-colonial scholars like Professor Tintagkar Roy and Lord Meghnad Desai, to dismiss or run down the economic achievements of the Nehruvian era. A position which is now tom-tommed by the allies of colonialism and neocolonialism, the Hindu communal right wing. They do it in a much more uncivilized, lower level, but nevertheless, they make the same point. Looking back from the vantage point of the high growth rates since the economic reforms of 1991, the Nehru years are now described as the wasted opportunity. The strategy of trying to reverse the colonial structuring of the Indian economy through inward-oriented, import-substituting, self-reliant growth, which involved protecting the fledgling domestic industry, was now described as the main problem. As Meghnad Desai put it, I'm quoting him, the first 40 years of India's independence were wasted. Now, this assessment could only be made by an economist because it is totally ahistorical. If the post-1991 strategy was adopted in India in the 1950s, India would surely have headed towards becoming a banana republic. Conversely, it would not make any sense to have the 1950s economic strategy in the 1990s, when the nature of the global economy, including of the Indian economy, had undergone fundamental changes. The Nehruvian era, and this is the point Ashokji made in the very beginning about Bhagwati and Manmohan Singh both being Nehruvian to begin with, but then arguing something else. That is, it is precisely because the historical conjuncture had changed. The Nehruvian era created the conditions for the future opening up and growth. Today's India is possible because of the base laid in the early decades of independence. It has not emerged despite it, but it has emerged because of it. The Nehruvian phase has to be seen in the global historical context of that period. As Dr. Manmohan Singh, the economist who as finance minister inaugurated the structural adjustment program in India in 1991, he acknowledged, and I'm quoting Manmohan Singh, he said, in 1960, if you had asked anybody which country would be on top of the League of the Third World in 1996 or 97, India was considered to be the front runner, unquote. there was a consensus among a wide variety of economists in the world at that time, including among very prominent economists in the West, names you will all recognize. Let me rattle off a few. W. Rostow, Rosenstein Rodan, Wilfred Mallenbaum, George Rosen, Ian Little, Brian Radaway. I'm just naming a few. They all argued that the direction of the Indian planning effort was a very positive one with great potential. It was quite common in Nehru's time to eulogize the democratic Indian path as opposed to the model followed by totalitarian China. There was, in fact, a dialectical relationship between the evolution of contemporary development theory and the Indian experience. So there is a link between economic theory as it emerged and the Indian experience under Nehru. As the reputed economist Sukhamay Chakravarti noted, I'm quoting him, dominant ideas of contemporary development economics influenced the logic of India's plans, and correspondingly, development theory itself was for a while greatly influenced by the Indian case. However, quite contrary to historical fact, the list of the alleged failures of Nehru in the economic sphere has kept growing. Neglect of Indian agriculture, incomplete land reforms, neglect of primary education, overemphasis on capital goods industries at the cost of consumer good industries, statism, and much else. The demonization of Nehru, as I said in the beginning, has received an impetus in recent years with the rise of the BJP, a political strand which was not only not linked with the national liberation movement, but which chalked out the idea of India, but actually stood diametrically opposed to it. It is this idea of India which Nehru brilliantly tried to implement in the newly born independent Indian state, and the BJP naturally has no sympathy for it. To students of contemporary history like me, this demonization of Nehru looks like the world turned upside down. In this essay, we will make a brief attempt to set the record straight. The path that was followed after independence to undertake the stupendous task of rebuilding the Indian economy ravaged by colonialism was not chosen by Nehru alone. The independent Indian state, which was a product of the Indian national movement, had to undertake the task of nation building within the parameters of the basic ideas of this movement, which is what we call popularly the idea of India. This is because the post-revolutionary state anywhere globally inevitably bears the imprint, the ideology, the strategy and methods and social base and ideals of the movement of which it is a product. In the Indian case, it was particularly a product of the movement because the Indian national movement was a prolonged mass movement. It was not a coup or a revolutionary overthrow by organized cadre-based professional revolutionaries or guerrillas, or by an overthrow by a revolutionary army, which meant that the basic ideas of the movement, to just briefly name them, the basic ideas, a commitment to a secular and inclusive democracy, sovereignty, anti-imperialism, and a pro-poor orientation, these ideas went deep down into the minds of the Indian people and became hegemonic ideas. They went deep down because it was a movement which lasted over nearly 100 years, and because it was a movement which involved the people of the country, millions of them. The independent Indian state, therefore, had to undertake the task of nation building within the parameters of these basic ideas. These were the compulsions and contexts laid down by history, which is often ignored by economists and other social scientists. That's why the necessity of contemporary history. Nobody at independence, for example, could argue that India should launch on a path where an authoritarian state in partnership with an industrial bourgeoisie would push through rapid development, or on a path where India adopt a position of junior partner to one of the superpowers in order to grow rapidly under its umbrella. I'm giving these two examples. These are very obvious examples from some of the East Asian countries which witnessed rapid economic growth after the Second World War. Anybody who argued any of these two positions in India would be consigned to the dustbin of history. And indeed, nobody from the right to the left, from the capitalists to the socialists and communists, argued either of these two positions. That is, they stayed within the parameters of the idea of India laid down by the national movement, which meant that if maintenance of sovereignty and democracy with civil liberties were two non-negotiables bequeathed to independent India by the national movement, then all efforts at post-colonial transformation in India had to occur within these parameters. However, it's important to remember that never before in history was the process of transition to industrialism or the process of primitive accumulation of capital accomplished along with democracy. It happened in no other country. The Nehruvian attempt at industrial transformation with democracy was thus a unique effort. Nehru, as a profound intellectual, was deeply conscious of this and often spoke about it as being a path, I'm quoting him, of being an uncharted path, unique in history. The non-negotiable commitment to democracy meant that the necessary surplus required for investment in order to facilitate transition to industrialism could not be raised forcibly on the backs of the Indian working class and the peasantry, or on the backs of colonial surplus appropriation, as happened in the case of the other countries in the West which had industrialized. Nehruvian state intervention and planning was to be consensual. It was not to be a command performance. The path of extracting surplus out of agriculture through, say, land tax, as happened in Japan, 50% land tax, or forced collectivization, of forcing surplus out of labor through slavery, indentured labor, or the absence of organized trade union movements, or of forcing surplus out of people out of other countries by collecting tribute. Now, these paths were not open to India. In fact, while during colonial rule, the Indian peasant often ended up handing over more than half of his gross produce as land tax and rent. After independence, the establishment of a democratic regime based on popular will meant that not only was there no tax or surplus extraction by the state from agriculture, on which an overwhelming majority of the Indian people were dependent, but a net transfer of income to agriculture occurred through state subsidies. Also, trade union rights to the working class were guaranteed from the very beginning and shot up rapidly after independence. Of course, the question of appropriating colonial tribute from other countries would not even arise in the Indian case. In fact, even after India's independence, Nehru remained a relentless champion of liberation movements against imperialism, imperialist domination in other parts of the world. Similarly, the non-negotiable commitment to sovereignty meant that the transition to modernity could not be accomplished with foreign aid, foreign capital, or foreign intervention in any manner that would make India into a junior partner of any advanced country, however powerful that may be. The imperative of maintaining sovereignty was a natural pointer towards non-alignment in the new post-World War, Cold War situation where the world was divided into two power blocks. The policy of non-alignment, in other words, was as much a function of the strategy of economic development chosen by India as it was a product of the Indian national movement's commitment to world peace and sovereignty of nation states. Nehru and the early Indian planners had correctly understood that political independence was of little value if it could not be used to acquire first economic and then intellectual independence. At independence, because of the nature of colonialism India had been subjected to, India was almost completely dependent on the advanced world for capital goods and technology for making any investment. That is, for any growth. At independence, we were still dependent on the advanced world. In 1950, to give you an example, India met nearly 90% of its need of machines and even machine tools like pliers and wrenches through imports. This meant that despite political independence, she was completely dependent on the advanced countries for achieving any economic growth through investment. This is precisely what is normally called a neo-colonial type situation, which needed immediate remedy. And this is what the famous Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy tried to reverse by adopting a path of industrialization based on heavy industry or capital good industry. To give you some very quick statistics, during the first three-year plans, 1951 to 65, industry in India grew at 7.1% per annum. This was a far cry from deindustrialization of the 19th century and the slow industrial growth of 1914 to 47. But more important than that, more important than just the higher growth rate, was the following fact, that the threefold increase in aggregate industrial production between 1951 and 1969 was a result of a 70% increase in consumer good industries, a quadrupling of intermediate goods production, intermediate goods meaning things like steel, sulfuric acid, heavy chemicals, etc., and a 10-fold increase in the output of capital goods. That is what happened in these 51 to 69. This pattern of industrial development led to a structural transformation of the colonial legacy that we inherited at independence. Again, just one statistic should make it clear. From a situation at independence where to make any capital investment, we had to import 90% of the machinery. By 1960, we had to import only 43%. And by 1974, only 9%. That is about 91% of our economic, of the investment that was necessary for economic growth, we could do on our own basis. And this is occurring when the total investment has increased by about 2.5 to 3 times. So on the one hand, you're increasing your investments, and on the other hand, you're increasingly making it on the basis of your own resources. So Atmanirbharta doesn't come by just shouting Atmanirbharta, but actually doing it in practice. This was a major achievement, and it considerably increased India's autonomy from the advanced countries in determining her own rate of capital accumulation or growth. It created the key condition for non-alignment or relative independence from both the power blocks at a time when this power block, the two superpowers, dominated the world. In our understanding, no amount of diplomatic finesse could achieve and sustain the objective of non-alignment without the economic basis of a relative autonomy having been created. It was this unstructuring of the colonial structure which was to later enable India to participate in the globalization process with considerable advantage to itself, rather than by participating in the globalization process, India getting sucked in as junior partners. As India at independence did not have a sufficiently large indigenous private sector to take on the task of the massive task of developing capital good industries, the only other option was to develop it through the public sector. The option of basing the development of this sector on foreign capital did not arise, as the Nehruvian consensus was that sovereignty would be achieved only if industrial development was primarily done indigenously and not based on foreign capital. The public sector was clearly seen by a wide spectrum of opinion which included the capitalists. In fact, if you read the Bombay Plan of 1945, it almost anticipates the first plan on this count, including the capitalists and the left as the alternative to foreign capital domination. So the public sector was not necessarily seen as an alternative to private enterprise if it was available, but a substitute to foreign capital. While reducing dependence on foreign capital and technology for making indigenous investment was one way of gaining and keeping India's sovereignty intact, other strategies were also adopted. Just to give you one example, the Geographical Concentration Index, the GCI in brief, of trade with foreign countries declined sharply. That is, an attempt was made to reduce our dependence on some key countries like USA and UK, etc., considerably. The GCI declined from 0.69 in 1947 to 0.22 in 1975. The result of the declining GCI was that the share of the metropolitan countries of the West, which earlier dominated India's trade, declined sharply. For example, the share of UK and USA in India's exports, which was 45% in 1947, fell by more than half. And by 1977, it was only 20%. This was partly achieved by the increase in India's trade with the socialist bloc, which bailed out India at a time when she was extremely short of foreign exchange, and other underdeveloped countries. Another area of concern for the maintenance of India's sovereignty and ability to stay non-aligned was India's food security. Indian agriculture, as I've mentioned, had stagnated and even declined under colonial rule. And at independence, India was faced with acute food shortage and famine conditions. 14 million tons of food had to be imported between 1946 and 1953. It put a big brake on our planning effort. The resources that went into just importing food to survive, to prevent a famine. There could be no sovereignty in India if India was to be dependent on food aid for its very survival. Indian agriculture needed to be revolutionized, and Nehru took up the task on a war footing. It is wrongly alleged, it is a lie in my opinion, that Nehru ignored agriculture with his focus on industrialization. Nehru pushed through the extremely difficult task of land reforms in India within a democratic framework. Again, unprecedented in history, basing himself on the long and powerful heritage of the national and peasant movements in the country. A remarkable achievement in contrast to the forced land reforms achieved in the Soviet Union or China, costing millions of lives, or the land reforms of Japan under an army of occupation led by General MacArthur. By 1957, the back of the over 150-year-old zamindari system was broken. Cooperative and institutional credit considerably weakened the stranglehold of the money lender. To give you one example, loan advanced by such institutions, that is cooperatives and institutional credit, increased by more than 15 times, rising from 0.23 billion in 1950 to 3.65 billion in 1965. Such institutional reforms were combined with major investments in scientific and agricultural research, irrigation, electric power projects, and so on. A veritable army of village-level workers, Gram Sevak as they were called, block development officers, were spread out in hundreds of thousands of Indian villages, trying to provide support and help improving farm methods. Nehru made no false dichotomy between agriculture and industry. Keenly aware that an agrarian transformation was not possible without an industrial transformation, that is, without electricity, without tractors, without pumps, without chemical fertilizers, etc., you couldn't have had a green revolution. He therefore pushed for industrial transformation simultaneously with agricultural reforms. The combination of institutional changes, that is the land reforms, and massive state-sponsored technological change transformed Indian agriculture rapidly. During the first 3 plans, and this statistics will will surprise you, during the first 3 plans, leaving 1965-66 out, that is a drought year, you never take a peculiar year as an end year, Indian agriculture grew at an annual rate of over 3% per annum. This was a growth rate, hold your breath, 8 times faster than the annual growth rate of the previous half century, from 1891 to 1946. And we say that Nehru ignored agriculture. Attempts are made sometimes to contrast Nehru with his successor, Lal Bahadur Shastri, the latter in his all too brief a tenure being credited with ushering in of the Green Revolution strategy. The reality is somewhat different. It is clear that by the late 50s and early 60s, as the benefits of the land reforms that could be carried out in Indian conditions had begun to peak, and the possibilities of agricultural growth based on extension of agriculture, that is bringing more area into cultivation, were also reaching their limit, Nehru's focus inevitably shifted towards technological solutions. Even the new agricultural strategy associated with the Green Revolution of picking out select areas with certain natural advantages for intensive development with a package program, the so-called IADP, or the Intensive Agricultural Districts Program, was launched in 15 districts, one for each state, on an experimental basis during the 3rd plan in Nehru's lifetime, a practice which was to be generalized on a large scale a few years later. As one of the major scholars of the Green Revolution, G.S. Bhalla, put it, the qualitative technological transformation in India, the Green Revolution, came about not during his lifetime, but soon after his death. But the foundations for the technological development were laid during Nehru's times. Nehru thus not only brought about major institutional reforms, that is the land reforms in Indian agriculture, without which you could not have had the Green Revolution, he also laid the foundations for the technological reforms, the basis of the Green Revolution, which made India food surplus in a remarkably short period of time. No wonder one of the best experts or the keenest observers of Indian agriculture at that time, Professor Daniel Thorner, made the following comment. I'm quoting Daniel Thorner. It is sometimes said that the initial 5-year plans, that is the Nehruvian plans, neglected agriculture. This charge, he says, cannot be taken seriously. The facts are that in India's first 21 years of independence, more has been done to foster change in agriculture, and more change has actually taken place than in the preceding 200 years. I will leave it at that. Jawaharlal Nehru was acutely aware of India's backwardness in science and technology, an area deliberately left barren in the colonial period, and therefore made massive efforts to overcome this shortcoming. Focus on scientific education at the highest level was seen by Nehru as a necessary part of achieving and maintaining sovereignty by reducing the dependence on the advanced world. If you become independent in capital goods, but you still require all the scientific input into making those, you're still dependent on the advanced world. Therefore, an unprecedented increase occurred in educational opportunities in science and technology in the universities and institutes set up in the early years after independence. Almost all the major institutions in this area, from the IITs, the CSIR, the Council of the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, the National Physical Laboratory, the National Chemical Laboratory, the All India Institute, the IDPL, Hindustan Antibiotics, just numerous institutions were all set up in Nehruvian era. The early plans, we must remember, were not only about steel plants and irrigation dams and hydroelectric power. They were as much about creating the scientific knowledge basis for transformation. National expenditure on scientific research and development grew at an exponential rate. Just to give you one figure, it increased from rupees 10 million in 1949 to 4.5 billion in 1977. Over roughly the same period, the stock of India's scientific and technological manpower increased by 12 times, from 190,000 to 2.23 million. A spectacular growth by any standards. A growth whose benefit India reaps today as the world has moved towards a knowledge society. Nehru brilliantly, in my opinion, anticipated the knowledge revolution. India's growth today, as you are aware, is primarily powered by the service sector, which is based entirely on the knowledge economy. Nehru's focus on science and technology, the highest level, was not counterpoised to primary education, as is often alleged. Nehru's commitment to primary education from as early as the 1931 Karachi Resolution, which was drafted by him, which committed the state to providing free and compulsory basic education, Nehru's commitment to that remained steadfast. The government system of primary school education, to which my parents and grandparents and many of my generation got their education from, this system during the Nehruvian era is a stark contrast to the near destruction of that public government education system that we witness today. It is not Nehru, but it is what we have done after Nehru to this system, where we have pushed our children, even the poor, to the rapacious private sector. You go to any village and you will find that they go to these so-called private English schools. Rather than building on the public education system painstakingly built up in the Nehruvian era, we have allowed it, not only allowed it to die, in fact, active efforts are made to dismantle it in the current neoliberal push that we are witnessing in this area. Finally, let us turn to the third element of the legacy of the national movement, the pro-poor orientation. Nehru's success in keeping India on the democratic path, on the democratic civil libertarian path against considerable odds, while most other post-colonial countries faltered on that count, by itself ensured that the poor were not altogether left out of the development process, or that their condition was not totally ignored. It is now well recognized that democracy is critical for the survival of the poor. It is democracy in India which has ensured that an inflationary path of growth, which hits the poor the hardest, has never been adopted. The trend rate of inflation in India since independence had not touched two digits for several decades. No government in India, irrespective of their political ideology, was able to ignore the political implications of uncontrolled inflation for many decades after independence. I'm not talking of today. Also, it is democracy and civil liberties, and this is important, that ensured no large-scale famine deaths could occur in India since independence, despite some extreme conditions created by climate shocks in the 60s and in the 70s. While more than 40 million died in famines in China in the late 1950s and 60s, which the world got to know decades later because of the absence of a free media, Amartya Sen has emphasized the role of civil liberties and a free press, which was so central to the Nehruvian scheme of things in preventing such mass man-made disasters in India. With more than 70,000 newspapers, 700 satellite channels, and nearly 30 newspapers with a daily readership of more than 1 million, it is not easy to keep famine conditions under cover in India. While political democracy was understood by Nehru to be a necessary condition for people's empowerment, it was by no means taken to be sufficient. As he put it in 1952, if poverty and low, I'm quoting him, if poverty and low standards continue, then democracy, for all its fine institutions and ideals, ceases to be a liberating force. It must therefore aim continuously at the eradication of poverty. In other words, Nehru says, political democracy is not enough. It must develop into economic democracy also. Nehru was deeply aware that active efforts had to be made and institutional structures had to be created which would enable the mass of the people to achieve a life of dignity. He set up the massive community development program, as I mentioned earlier in 1952, aimed at ameliorating all aspects of people's lives in the remote villages, from improvement in agricultural methods to communications, education, health, etc. His objective through this program, and I'm quoting him, was, quote, to unleash forces from below among our people by creating conditions in which spontaneous growth from below was possible. The ultimate aim, he said, was progressively producing a measure of equality in opportunity. As the tendency towards bureaucratization began to emerge in the programs that Nehru himself had adopted, the community development programs, etc. And Nehru, more than anyone else, was deeply aware that the dependence on the bureaucracy to make the transformation in India was one of his major errors. He tried to once he saw this bureaucratization, Nehru tried to integrate the bureaucratic programs, bureaucracy-headed programs, with the Panchayati Raj institutions, that is, elected local self-governing bodies. And he set up a large program of cooperatives and banking, marketing, and other services, benefiting and empowering millions of peasants. Emphasizing the critical role of local village-level self-governing cooperative institutions, Nehru said, I'm quoting, I feel more and more that we must function more from below than from the top. The top is important, of course, and in the modern world, a large measure of centralization is inevitable. Yet, too much centralization means decay at the roots and ultimately a withering away of the branches and leaves and flowers. Therefore, we have to encourage these basic organs of the village. However, the struggle to make these local institutions function in favor of the most deprived was not an easy task, particularly in a greatly class, caste, and gender divided society like ours. In fact, decades after Nehru passed away, it was Rajiv Gandhi who had to take the initiative to reinvigorate the Panchayati Raj institutions by proposing that elections to these bodies be made mandatory and the deprived castes, tribes, and women be given adequate representation in them, which is what resulted in the 73rd and 74th Amendment in the Indian Constitution as late as 1993. The process of trying to empower the poor and disadvantaged is still carrying on as it must in the future. But the foundations undoubtedly were laid by Jawaharlal Nehru. Nehru was deeply influenced by Marxism since the late 1920s. His contribution in embedding and then making widely acceptable the socialist ideal of empowering the poor among the Indian people was immense. The fact that not only the communists and socialists, but an overwhelming majority of nationalist opinion in India since the late 1930s accepted socialism as an objective was to a great extent because of Nehru. So deeply did this idea get rooted among the Indian people as a whole that as late as 1980, when the decidedly right-wing Jansangh, which had nothing to do with socialism or with Gandhi or the national movement, when it was reborn in a new avatar called the Bharatiya Janata Party, it chose to call itself a Gandhian socialist party. So the socialist ideal had gone very deep indeed. Now it is a dirty word. It has been made a dirty word by the erstwhile Gandhian socialists. But we mustn't forget that that is not how it was. Nehru was able to give the socialist ideal such wide acceptability in India, partly because he made a very early break, and this is very important, from a narrow, sectarian, rigid interpretation of Marxism, which his break has been called by India's leading historian of modern and contemporary period, Professor Bipin Chandra. He called it a break from quote unquote, Stalin Marxism. Nehru was among the first in the world to make this break from Stalin Marxism, roughly at the same time as the famous Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. As early as the 1930s, late 1930s, Nehru was groping for a strategy of social transformation in a democratic or semi-democratic framework, which was different from the insurrectionary and violent Bolshevik model that was not suitable for such situations. Learning from the practice of the Gandhian movement made it easier for Nehru to break from the Stalin Marxist paradigm and argue somewhat precociously that while there could be no true democracy without socialism, there could be no socialism without democracy. He insisted, and he was prophetic in this characterization, that there could be no democracy without socialism and no socialism without democracy. He insisted that civil liberty and democracy had to be a basic part of socialism. The socialist transformation required societal consensus, the consent of the overwhelming majority of the people. It could not be a minority revolution led by a band of highly committed revolutionaries or a quote-unquote dictatorship of the proletariat. It was not enough just to have a majority. To succeed, it had to be a socialism acceptable by all sections, by an overwhelming majority. Nehru was anticipating what later events were to validate and what was to be slowly accepted globally. For example, the Euro-communist movement in the 1970s. By the late 1930s, Nehru began to veer towards the position that socialism could not be brought about by coercion or force. How can you arrive at a consensus, he said, by force? He argued that to achieve the desirable end of socialist transformation, one should not adopt the means of hatred and violence, and that a socialistic pattern of society could be achieved through non-violent and peaceful means. Fully in tune with the Gandhian notion that wrong means could not achieve right ends, he declared he said, there is always a close and intimate relationship between the end we aim at and the means we adopt to attain it. Even if the end is right and the means are wrong, it will vitiate the end or divert us in the wrong direction. Also, arriving at a socialist consensus would mean that one would have to view it as a process and not an event arrived at some revolutionary moment. This would have to be a long drawn-out process with its ups and downs, a process which may have to slow down at time, moderate, tone down its immediate goals in order to carry the bulk of the people along, including those who held opposing positions. Nehru's writing from prison as early as the 1940s, this is in The Discovery of India, we see his understanding of how he saw the National Planning Committee, which were formed in 1938 and which in a sense preceded the Planning Commission. He says in Discovery, it became clear to me that our National Planning Committee was inevitably leading us towards establishing some of the fundamentals of the socialist structure. It was limiting the acquisitive factor in society. It was based on planning and the benefit of the common man, raising his standards greatly, giving him opportunities of growth. And all this was to be attempted in the context of democratic freedom with a large measure of cooperation of some, at least, of the groups who were normally opposed to the socialist doctrine. That is, you have to carry the other side with you. That cooperation seemed to be worthwhile, even if it involved toning down or weakening of the plan in some respects. It is this consensual attitude that Nehru adopted, which enabled India to progress after independence with a consensus. That is, our liberation did not end with the civil war, as many other liberations elsewhere in the world did. You were able to carry all sections of society with you. Evident in this quotation that I gave you from The Discovery is the notion of taking steps in the socialist direction, rather than establishing of socialism by immediate overthrow of the existing structure. Involved in it is also the notion of taking these steps within the democratic framework, accepting the logic of adopting such a framework by taking steps, including partial compromises, which made it possible to carry along a wide section of society. Nehru was therefore to remain throughout his life, Nehru was to retain throughout his life this nuanced, persuasive style of functioning while remaining resolute in his goals, which brought him the support, love, and admiration of the millions in a manner which was surpassed only by Gandhiji. As a true disciple of the master, while appealing to all sections of society, he succeeded in keeping his gaze focused on the poor, the oppressed, and the disadvantaged. His great achievement was that he got a very large part of Indian society, individuals and institutions, to share his socialist vision. In the Nehruvian period, from the Planning Commission and the public sector bureaucracy to the media and popular films as well, the socialist objective was seen as a desirable one. Think of all your Raj Kapoor films. This socialism was not defined in a narrow fundamentalist way, but as Nehru broadly outlined it. The economy that Nehru inherited did not generate enough resources to launch major anti-poverty measures. Yet, poverty declined impressively. In the early years after independence, the biggest anti-poverty measures were the steps taken towards land reform, creating credit and other service cooperatives, investment in public health and education, and later the green and the white revolutions. Today, more than half a century after his death, with infinitely higher economic capacity to empower the poor, when we falter hopelessly on this count, we realize how important it is to remember Nehru's legacy. With more than 25 years of high growth rates, hovering between 6 to 9%, with enough resources to launch some of the world's biggest anti-poverty programs like Manrega, India still has a totally unacceptable situation of more than at least 300 million people in dire poverty. 46% of our children are still malnourished. 1 out of 3 children in India of school-going age are out of school. They do not go to school. The Human Development Index for many parts of the country is shamefully below that of sub-Saharan Africa. On top of all this, attempts are now being made by the current regime to starve funds of the Manrega and other programs such as the ICDS aimed at reaching minimal nutrition, education, and health to the poorest. We have fallen to the 151st position in Global Hunger Index. We are among the, we've reached one of the highest levels in hunger. We are even below Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal on the Global Hunger Index. The obscene levels of inequality and crony capitalism prevalent today was inconceivable in Nehruvian times. Scenes of floating bodies on the Ganga for lack of resources to commit their last rites, or of thousands of migrant workers walking thousands of miles to their villages in extreme heat with their children, their old, their infirm, dragging them along. Scenes which have shaken the world's conscience were unthinkable in Nehru's time. I would sum up thus. While Nehru's legacy in keeping India's sovereignty intact has to a great extent, though not fully, survived, the secular democratic structures face a very serious challenge today. And many of my previous speakers, as well as the ones following me, will be talking about that. The failure on the equity front also is equally shocking. The Indian elite, by and large, has turned its gaze away from the poor and its oppressed minorities, once again forefronting the need to return to Gandhi and Nehru and create popular movements to keep the idea of India alive in the fullest sense. Just as the more than 1 year long farmers movement has achieved today. Thank you so much.
Brilliant, sir. That is one word that comes to my mind immediately. Is reading like a book intensely or reading an intense book, either way. And it opens a lot of doors for further inquiry. There are some questions. Will you take, sir? Will you
Sure.
take some questions? Okay. First of all, just an observation. This talk is an eye opener. Thank you, Professor Mukherjee, says Mr. Alok Lal. And Professor Rohit Prasad, Professor Economics of MDI, Professor Rohit Prasad, his question is, after decoupling from the colonial structure, should a transition to a liberalized economy have been planned earlier? We waited till the mid-80s, in the process missed out on the growth of global trade that benefited East Asia. I'll ask other questions later. Please take this one.
Thank you, Professor, for asking this question. Absolutely correct. That one must answer this question, that why did we not make the transition earlier? After all, China did in 1978. All post-colonial countries which adopted globalization later needed these 30 to 40 years. China needed its Mao, India needed its Nehru, Indonesia needed its Sukarno, Egypt needed its Nasser, and so on and so forth. These were not wasted years. But then once the Nehruvian path had achieved its whatever was possible, it had reached its limit. Why did we not make the transition? Especially when, in fact, Manmohan Singh, in his thesis that he wrote in Oxford in 1965 or 66, I think, had already made this point. Jagdish Bhagwati also, who like Manmohan Singh were Nehruites at that time, were beginning to talk about it by the mid-60s and early 70s, saying that the time for a shift has occurred, the global economic situation has changed. The East Asian tiger example that you gave was correct, that here was an opportunity. There was no need for this export pessimism, which was a reality in the 1950s. It is no longer true. But why did we not make a shift? That's where the international and internal political situation comes in. That's why economics, that's why political economy is the discipline. You cannot explain economic factors simply by looking at economics. What was happening internationally in the mid-60s? At that time, the United States, using the vulnerability of the Indian economy in the mid-60s because of the two wars, 62, 65, the droughts in Bihar and stuff like that, the huge rise in oil prices by 4 times and so on, the Indian economy was in a very weak stage. That is the time the United States tried to flex its muscles. That is when they tried to use what is called the ship-to-mouth strategy, that you may change your policy on Vietnam, otherwise the next shipment is not going to come to meet your famine-like conditions, right? So there was this very strong, and that was therefore not the best time to open up to the world. It was felt in India. Internationally, politically, that was not the best time. Internally, the political situation in India had become such that, as you know, there was a split in the Congress party, and Indira Gandhi could retain power by allying with the communists in 1971 to retain power. So there was a breakup internally within of the right wing and the left wing, and the left wing succeeded with support of the communists. So therefore, this was not the opportune time to again make the shift into the globalized world. Thirdly, and most importantly, in a democratic society, you do not make fundamental changes overnight. You cannot do a Deng on Mao. I'm very fond of saying this. Mao dies and Deng comes to power and says that I don't care what the color of the cat is so long as it catches mice. Catching mice is growth. And if it comes with capitalism, if it comes with hugging the United States, which was our greatest enemy till now, we will reverse everything. Now you can do that in China, but you can't do that in India. where I said that the basic values of the freedom struggle, of democracy, of sovereignty, etc., were so deeply ingrained that you could not easily fool around with them. To give you an example, Indira Gandhi was a very popular prime minister, 16 years as prime minister. But when she messed with democracy during the emergency, the Indian people booted her out. So it is not easy. You could not make this transition unless the consensus had shifted. And that is precisely what happens. The Nehruvian consensus gradually, bit by bit, through a lot of intellectual effort, shifts by the 70s and 80s. You find that precisely the Nehruites, the left economists, people like Amartya Sen, Sukumar Chakravarti, write notes to the as economic advisor to the government, saying that now is the time to make a shift. People like I could name you half a dozen left economists at that time who made this shift. So there was this shift, and therefore you did arrive at a consensus for reform by 1991. Such a consensus that a minority government of Narasimha Rao could make this fundamental change. And every government that has come to power after that, including the United Front government, which had communists in it, that is with communist support, even that did not oppose the economic reforms. So it takes time, and that is why I think the reason why we had a shift which was later than in China was a mixture of all these factors. I'm sorry I took too long to answer your question because it was such an important question that you asked.
No, thank you very much. This question actually merited that kind of time even more, perhaps. Dr. Shirish Kumar from Geneva would like to ask you, were the dissenting voices of B.R. Shenoy and later Vakil and Brahmanand valid?
If you would please tell me which dissenting voices and on what lines you're asking me these questions, then maybe I could respond. Dissent in what sphere?
Shirish, you could unmute yourself and rephrase or add to your question. Could you unmute Shirish, please?
I have allowed everyone. He's unmuted.
He's unmuted. He's unmuted.
Yes, Shirish, would you like to?
Yes, I'm no economist at all. So mine would be a very, very basic question. What I meant was when one reads the critique of the Nehruvian model in different articles, they say that the first dissenting voice was Shenoy's when the Planning Commission's second plan was there. And later, the Bombay group of economists like Vakil and Brahmanand were warning regarding wage goods like food and textiles, and that would lead to inflation and money incomes. Were those well thought out critiques, or it was an inherent part of Nehruvian economics that these would be inevitable?
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, Vakil and Brahmanand are outstanding economists, and it would be quite surprising if there were no critique of the Nehruvian strategy. It was bound to be. It was an experiment, as I told you, an unprecedented experiment. There were bound to be critiques, there were bound to be problems, and Nehru welcomed them. If I may go slightly off track on this and say to you that when the Nehru-Mahalanobis plan was written, the whole strategy was written out. This I got from Manmohan Singh when he became the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. Being an academic, he started looking at the files. Manmohan Singh said this in a public function, and I'm just quoting him, while releasing a book. He said when he started looking at the files, he also started looking at the margins, which is where all the interesting things happen, isn't it? Which is where you know why the RTI, the governments do not want those notings to be revealed. So he looked at the notings and he found that Nehru asked the bureaucrats, his bureaucracy, to widely share the strategy, the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy globally. and get opinions from it. But the bureaucracy being the bureaucracy, they shared it with people who they thought were slightly Nehruite in their thinking, left-wing, liberal, in that kind of people. So when Nehru saw that list, he was furious. He says, you wasted the paper. Obviously, they will agree with us. Send it to people who will not agree with me. And then it was sent, believe it or not, it was sent to Milton Friedman of the Chicago School. And Friedman actually commented on the plans. So there were people that, I mean, in Nehru's time, he did not encourage and did not allow, in fact, this notion that one man knows all, from demonetization to everything is known by one super brain. Nehru was aware that he is one of the persons who making this experiment, and he encouraged people to critique, and therefore people openly critique. So surely this was, when you're competing between two goods, it is a good to give cheap consumer goods to the poor. But it is also extreme importance. It's a very, very good thing to get economic sovereignty from the Western world by developing internally your capital goods and your other technology, etc. So it is not one bad versus one good. It is two goods. When you have to choose between them, there are bound to be people pointing out that, look, are we slipping up there? I take these critiques in that manner, in a sense of friendly critiques, unlike the kind of critiques of Nehru that you see, which is abusive and which is not constructive.
Shirish, is it okay? Okay. I think I'll give the thing to Dr. Rohit Prasad because he still has something to say. And first of all, he's very happy about the answer that you gave. Now, Mr. Abilal would like to ask some questions, some of which you have already kind of touched upon. In what ways did what is called Nehruvian socialism differ from classical socialism? That is one part of the question. What were the economists that influenced Nehru's model of economics? And the third one is, I don't know whether you would like to answer that, was the so-called Hindu rate of growth due to Nehru's policy or despite them?
I mean, I'm very unhappy with the phrase Hindu rate of growth. That there was, there was nothing Hindu about it. But then people catch on to these kinds of, nice sounding things. The rate of growth. K.N. Raj wrote a brilliant book. I don't have the title with me just now, but I can easily get it for you. Where he said that when you compare two countries, you don't compare two countries at the same point of time. You compare these two countries at what historical stage those countries are at. Otherwise, it is like comparing apples and oranges. That is, if India begins its industrialization process in the mid 20th century, then you don't compete India with USA or England in the mid 20th century. You compare India with early 19th century England at the early stages of industrialization. Right? Or you compare India with Japan of the late 19th century, 1860s onwards. And what Raj does is compares Japan of the 1860s onwards, when it goes on to this path of industrial transformation, with India since the 1950s. And he says India's record was phenomenal, far better, far faster, far superior. So that is how one should compare. So, again, as I said, it is ahistorical to say that yaar, sirf 3% rate growth tha. But where did you start from? What is your basis? Where are you coming from? If you do not create what was done in the Nehruvian period, it would be unthinkable to have the 9-10% rates of growth. That too, primarily created from within. It would be unthinkable. Japan got its 10% rate of growth, and after the Second World War, 1950 to 70, it grew at 10% for nearly 20 years, which is what catapulted Japan into the second largest economy in the world from being just one of the developing countries, right? But then it did it under the US umbrella, almost, as a semi-sovereign country. Now, those paths were not open to us. So given that's why I tried to frame the context in which Nehru is functioning, that you have to keep your democracy intact and you have to keep your sovereignty intact. Given that context, and given the context that you are at the very earliest stage, you are starting from abysmal conditions with virtually no capital good industries. You don't even produce pliers and wrenches, needles. To achieve the rates of growth where I think economists, or at least contemporary historians, are quite agreed that these rates of growth were not something to be ashamed of. They were pretty good in those conditions.
Thank you very much. Very, very satisfying reply. Professor Rohit Prasad, would you like to join and have a little interaction with Dr. Aditya Mukherjee? One second.
Yeah, I have asked him to unmute.
So, Rohit, okay, if he comes, then we will continue from here. But in the meanwhile, I think we'll go back to Professor Aditya Mukherjee. And why am I seeing Manas Lal's board and not Professor Aditya Mukherjee? Okay. All right, sir. So, Professor Mukherjee, it has been such a great pleasure to have you on this particular platform. This platform is being taken to new heights and not in a mono-directional sense. It has been such an enriching experience to be listening to you and before you some other speakers. So thank you so very much, Dr. Aditya Mukherjee, and I'm forever grateful to you. And I think I say it on behalf of the entire audience that it was a phenomenal exposure to the compulsions and the context of Nehru's economic policies, and more importantly, the thread of idealism and the marriage between political idealism and economic idealism is an amazing combination, which now I can see Nehru was able to achieve. It's absolutely unheard of, if that's the word I'm looking for. So thank you very much. But before we sign off, I'd like to also remind the audience that tomorrow we have yet another important facet of Nehru's word and work, and that is secularism. Professor Apurvanand Jha will speak on secularism tomorrow at the same time. We are not finishing our platform after the talks. It shall continue, and I would very much appreciate all the audience and everybody to please contribute. Please contribute your favorite quote of Nehru, for example, or whatever else. But we should stick to Nehru's word and Nehru's work. We have also requested, and people have come across voluntarily for that. Nasiruddin Shah has recorded some very, very good passages on Nehru, and that we will be putting on our Facebook page after the 20th. And all the videos of these talks will be available on YouTube shortly. So that's that. And thanks very much, Professor Aditya Mukherjee. It's been a great privilege, a great pleasure indeed. Thank you, sir.